The road to the Civil War was one long chain of compromises and attempts to keep an unstable balance from toppling over. It's almost insane to imagine the history of the United States going any other way than the Civil War. Slave power and the influence the aristocratic plantations had on Southern politics made secession to protect itself inevitable. What if in an alternate timeline, one change shaped early America in such a way that slavery doesn't become a behemoth in the South, and so it never secedes to protect it? And yes, the South seceded to protect slavery. They even say so. Here, and here, and here, and anywhere else. Just research it yourself. So what if the Civil War never happened? I know it sounds crazy. How does one change lead to the South never seceding? Well, it's not one change, it's one invention. The cotton gin. Cotton was the oil in the antebellum South, but it wasn't always like that. During colonial times, cotton was easy to grow, but it was difficult to harvest. Farmhands or slaves would need to pluck each seed of cotton from the stalk. That seed is what is used for clothes and textiles. Even with slave labor, not much cotton could be harvested to be profitable, and so it just wasn't worth it to plant. Instead, tobacco was farmed as the ideal cash crop. But by the turn of the 18th century, tobacco stopped being as good of an investment also, and with that, slaves. The reason why the Founding Fathers appeared to just kick the issue of slavery down the road wasn't just because they needed to keep the colonies united, or even because some owned slaves, but because it was a common conception at the time that slavery was on its way out, peacefully being discontinued for more profitable solutions. By the 1790s, the US outlawed the import of slaves and started cracking down on ships in the Atlantic, which did so. But this all changed in 1793 with the cotton gin. The cotton gin was invented to make the time-consuming process of picking individual cotton pieces obsolete. Now more seeds could be harvested and more cotton could be produced at an industrial scale. Long story short, this single invention vastly multiplied the production of cotton and made it a fantastic investment. Colonists expanded west as fast as they could, buying up much of the land to plant as much cotton as possible. Plantations grew, and the southern Mississippi River became the best property in the South. We can even see the effects of this in the demographics of the region today. By the early 19th century, the South was the largest producer of cotton in the world, selling it to Britain, Europe, and especially the North, who replaced their wool for cotton to make into textiles and clothing. And with new money, there came new power. A class of southern plantation owners who now had such vast amounts of wealth they could influence the government, the culture, and even the laws to protect their economic system. The South became ruled by an aristocracy, in a way. The institution that was on its way out was now a permanent system in the South, and losing that system was now never going to happen peacefully. In this alternate timeline, the cotton gin, or anything like it, simply isn't invented. That's it. The reason I'm choosing this as the divergence is simply, well, what other option is there? If the South mass-produced cotton in any way, then slave politics continue surviving. There is no piece of legislation that simply ends the practice peacefully as long as it's profitable. And really, neither side wanted to. Balance was the solution, not ending it, at least for most people. I'll talk about this later. We'll begin this alternate timeline somewhere in the 1820s and 30s. Without cotton becoming the gold mine for the South like in our timeline, it'd be harder and harder for plantations to financially justify the use of slave labor. That money not being used to pay labor was still being used to house and feed them. Cotton was so lucrative that the richest owners could afford to house vast numbers of slaves, but tobacco couldn't provide an income to do so on such a massive scale. It might be over a period of decades, but the practice of slavery slowly dies out naturally simply because it's too costly. It's probably replaced by a similar system we saw in the reconstructed South, where freed slaves came back to the fields they worked, but this time with a minimum amount of payment. This certainly isn't a happy scenario where everyone gets along or even can feed their family, but the economic behemoth of slavery is killed before it really divides the nation, and also people aren't being enslaved anymore. While the inevitable expansion of the US to the West doesn't change, manifest destiny and all, what might change is the inclusion of new states themselves. For 4 decades leading up to the Civil War, this balance between free and slave states dominated the creation of states. The struggle between slave and free over who would control seats in Congress. The Missouri Compromise established a border between these two factions, with any state below the 3630 parallel allowing slavery and above it free, excluding Missouri. Since Missouri was brought into the Union as a slave state, Maine was then created to equal things out. Perfectly balanced. Oh, you knew I was going to make that joke. In this alternate scenario, there is no need for Maine to exist as a state. Instead, it remains a part of Massachusetts. Now, as for Texas, alternate Texas, after its independence, is annexed immediately by the United States following its revolution, instead of remaining a nation for a decade. The reason why Texas was a nation for so long wasn't just because the US didn't want a war with Mexico, but it was because Texas was a slave state. Northerners didn't want another slave state added without a new free state of their own, and that didn't come to be until the 1840s. Then once Texas was included, it remained the massively large state we know and love today. The funny thing was, though, the rest of America thought Texas would have been too big as a state and wanted to break it up into 5 separate ones. However, this would have ruined the balance, so Texas kept its gigantic size. In this scenario, without the balance needed, Texas might have actually just been split into 5 separate states. You can imagine how that's divided up in any way. Ironically, the Lone Star State might have just become multiple stars on the American flag. The old border is seen as a thing of the distant past, like the Northwest Territory. If this did happen earlier, the Mexican-American War would occur a decade earlier than in our timeline, as Mexico still would see Texas as its territory. Borders are fun and all, but the biggest change that happens is inside the United States. A change that fundamentally alters the economic and social core of the 19th century US. It's often said that the North was able to industrialize while the South relied on cotton, but the thing was the North was only able to industrialize so quickly because of Southern cotton. The North's main industry was textiles. In fact, for the first half of the 1800s, textiles and other cotton-related industries were almost 50% of the US economy. Both North and South relied heavily on slave-picked cotton, just for different reasons. Without this cheap amount of resources to make clothing out of, the North would need to stick to what they've always used: wool, which is far more expensive to produce, gotta feed those sheep, and there'd be less wool available than cotton. This goes for Britain and Europe too, by the way, but we'll talk about those ramifications later. Without mass cotton plantations, the entire United States has a far smaller economy, but while the North would understandably be smaller without cheap textiles, the South practically doesn't have one in a world without the cotton gin. In our timeline, by the time of the war, the North had 17 million people, and the South had 13 million, but 4 million of those were slaves. Without slavery being practical, the population of slaves is dramatically smaller in an alternate timeline. After the cotton gin was invented, the slave population quadrupled in size, meaning that the South might have 5 million less people than the North. States like Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas were settled mainly due to their soil. This alternate South is far less populated, poor economically since it doesn't sell cotton to the North, and with that, more isolated from the North as well. Which brings up an interesting perspective. Even in a world without the cotton gin and the eventual decline of slavery willingly by the South, there still would be a divide culturally between North and South, simply because of geography and population. The Great Lakes and bountiful rivers allowed for transportation and expansion into places like Ohio and Illinois decades before the South could do the same, considering they had to trek through humid forests. Their waterways didn't go east to west like the Ohio or the Great Lakes, they go north to south. Long story short, the South would really just be separated from the rest of the nation, divided from the North by climate, geography, and economics to form its own culture as well, simply because of the cars that the settlers were dealt with. So what about the destiny of the now freed slaves themselves? At the time of the American Revolution, slaves made up 20% of the total population. Assuming that the institution doesn't increase after the 1790s, the black population of America doesn't explode like it did in the days of the antebellum South. So while the population probably grows, it doesn't as rapidly as in our timeline. Since the South would still be agrarian, they'd be paid cheap wages to work in the fields, much like it was after the Civil War. Racial policies probably wouldn't allow blacks to own much land, and they'd still be second-class citizens. The difference here is, even though they're not enslaved, the political rights of blacks in America are pretty much ignored, North and South. Slavery was much a dividing and driving issue that once it became a part of this great national conflict, then the treatment of blacks afterward were paid attention to by the North. But without slavery, or more importantly to the North, the political power of slavery, then the North simply doesn't care to put the time and effort into protecting the well-being of freed blacks in this remote part of the nation. That means laws such as the 14th and 15th Amendments created post-war would never have the political backing or need to be implemented so early. Blacks might not have true rights for decades further in this alternate timeline. This is the 19th century, where the fundamental idea was that whites and blacks were too far different to be in one considered nation. Their treatment and conditions would be pretty similar to the Chinese in California. The conditions and injustices done upon them, not really a concern for the rest of the country. Would this change in the 20th century? Perhaps. However, without that emotional attachment from the Civil War, civil rights is far harder to achieve or gain a national platform, along with other reasons that I'm going to get to later. So continuing on, it is an alternate 1861. By this time, Abe Lincoln never becomes president for many reasons. The most important is Lincoln only really won because, at the time of his election, the race was split between 4 different candidates, and also half of the country refused to have him on the ballot. And without the institution of slavery, I doubt such a mess of a race would happen and allow Lincoln to win, if he ever ran at all. By now, 4 decades without slave power, the line of politicians and presidents would be so dramatically changed that I can't even predict it. I doubt Buchanan would have even gone to office. You probably heard the common saying that before the Civil War, Americans saw themselves more as Ohioans or Virginians or New Yorkers than a part of any bigger nation. And overall, that was true. They saw themselves as a part of their states that were simply united. How united they were was only tested by the Civil War. And in the end, that unity was not simply a bunch of states together, but one single nation. Without that test of a war between the states, those states might continue on seeing themselves as more independent from not just the federal government, but from one another. That's one of the main things now missing from this alternate world. The revolution was the creation of the country, but the Civil War was almost a rebirth, a baptism by fire that defined how this new US would be in the next century. The ideas that the American civilization was the shining city on a hill and an experiment for God and democracy was something that became finalized in the Union cause. For the South, they had their own religious and moral reasons for rebelling, but the way the Union viewed the war, to keep that experiment of United Republic alive, continued on and evolved afterwards to redefine how America would see itself on the global stage. And it wasn't just that mindset that was created from the war. The war invited the federal government to have broader oversight, such as creating a new national currency, and perhaps unconstitutional laws on criticism of the government during wartime. None of those might exist in such an alternate timeline. As America ages without the centralized government birthed from war, Americans see themselves as a part of an alliance more than an actual country. As the rise of the modern nation-state takes place across the world in places like Germany and Italy, perhaps the US might attempt to centralize federal power. However, that'd be a massive debate, just as it is now. This type of mindset really transforms the United States on the international stage. Without such federal unity, how would the nation react to an inevitable world war, if one ever happens at all? Things get murky 20 years on from an event that in this timeline didn't happen. The war basically set the stage for Republicans in office for 40 years. From the 1860s to 1914, there had only been 2 Democrat presidents, counting the 2 terms of Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. So that's a bit of change politically. Speaking of Woodrow Wilson, like I said, such a change happens to American politics, I doubt we'd ever see Wilson become president. And with that, oh boy, a lot changes. That might be a video in itself. But just imagine a United States that is less of an interventionist power for the sake of protecting democracy. This doctrine is called Wilsonianism for a reason. Wilson was the one who first started using intervention as an excuse to replace European colonialism with American democracy. More like puppet governments that served US interests. We'd probably see a US more involved in its own affairs and less prone to being a world power, but that's just a shot in the dark. The cotton gin was not a very complex invention, and I doubt that even if Eli Whitney didn't invent it, that it simply wouldn't have been invented at some point. This entire scenario is based on the idea that this one thing doesn't get invented, yet it easily could have still happened because of the demand of cotton. The gin was invented and used for a reason, and it was to make cotton usable and profitable on a mass scale. It was the fuel for a rapidly industrializing world and laid the groundwork for an economy based around factories and wage labor rather than working at home. These factories brought people into the cities and created the modern world. Textiles were at the forefront of all of that, and that wouldn't have happened in Britain and the North without Southern cotton. So take in the entire scenario you've seen and imagine if somehow this invention still didn't happen, however unlikely that'd be. Then the most vital resource to Britain's textile factories, ground zero of the entire Industrial Revolution, doesn't happen either. With this alternate timeline, without the gin, slavery dies off naturally, but also so does the spark that led to the West's rapid rise in industry and modernization. The antebellum South is often seen as something isolated from the progress of the rest of the world, stuck in a time of agriculture while the North built factories, but it was actually just the first part in a massive machine. The plantation owners were the oil barons of their time, and their power came from selling their slave-picked cotton to places around the world which saw the practice as abhorrent, yet at the same time profited and improved their own societies from it. If you want to make some connections with today, diamonds are shiny and expensive, but are often mined by slave labor in Africa from warlords. We have cheap clothes and products today, but only because of labor paid practically nothing in China or third world nations. We fund and prop up horrendous regimes simply because they give us the resources we want. I'm not saying Chinese factory workers face the same conditions that literal slaves did back in the South. What I'm saying is that people often have this disconnect with the origins of the products they enjoy. The North saw slavery as horrendous, but at the same time kept those that supported it in power by buying their cotton. They seem to have this idea that once cotton was out of the South, it was somehow clean, but of course, it wasn't. It was still picked by slaves. So what we're left with is a world where an abhorrent practice ends very soon, but at the same time industrialization is delayed, or perhaps doesn't happen to the extent that it did. Society going into the 1900s resembles how it did a century prior. More agriculture, smaller industry, and less technological improvement. The US without bloodshed doesn't become a more centralized nation, and is even more divided between states and regions. This invention, and the entire war itself, really created the modern US, and in part, the modern world might not exist at all. In a way, this invention caused such pain and suffering for Americans of all races in slavery or war, it ended up leading to this, our modernized, connected world, all because cotton makes very nice shirts. Certainly something to ponder. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.